Welcome to another edition of Yorkton Stories, our look at Yorkton and area people and events, past and present. My name is Dick DeRike. We appreciate the support of our premier sponsors, Harvest Meats and Grain Millers, both here in Yorkton, and others who assist us in many ways. Our podcasts are available on our website, yorktonstories.ca, where you will also find photos, links, and other information associated with each podcast when available. You can not only hear the stories, you can also see and read information about the podcast topics. We can also be found on all major podcast directories, including Spotify, YouTube Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, TuneIn and Alexa, and iHeartRadio. Search for Yorkton Stories, and you will find us. Our podcasts cover many genres and styles. Some seek to preserve important history, some are more whimsical, some are just plain fun or interesting. Some explore sports or education or business. We have not talked much about religion. Common wisdom says that if you want to lose friends real quickly, start a conversation about politics or religion. So, fair warning, this podcast explores religion. Not religion in the conventional sense, but we explore beliefs and ideas that are seldom discussed in churches or at family gatherings or in education. I hope, after you listen to this, that we can still be friends. In the past 6 months, I reconnected with Shawn Sanford Beck, born in Yorkton and raised in the Willowbrook area, where for a time his father Brian was the principal and his mother Paula the school secretary and librarian. Shawn and my son were friends when they went to school together in Yorkton, and they have kept in touch since through social media. When I heard what Shawn was doing, I was fascinated because his work seemed to me to consist of several aspects that were totally contrarian to conventional thinking and teaching, and would be seen by many as two extreme opposites. Let me tell you what Shawn sent me in the first email exchange we had where we explored the possibility of doing a podcast. He said this: "The short version of my story is that I was ordained as an Anglican priest a bit more than 20 years ago. I'm currently in the process of shifting into ministry in the United Church of Canada, and in between I was in a number of ecclesial conflicts, attempting to stretch the Anglican Church to become more inclusive, especially of sexual minorities. I've also written about Christian animism, am a member of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, teach something called green priestcraft, have researched and experienced runes, folk magic, and healing traditions, and sometimes refer to myself as a Christo-pagan. That has made my life in the church, here on the prairies of Treaty 6 territory, interesting." I thought, well, no kidding, but it also whetted my appetite to see how he resolved what to me looked like very apparent conflicts. Shawn attended Willowbrook School, Yorkdale Junior High, and the Yorkton Regional High School. Then, after graduating in 1991, took 1 year of university classes in Yorkton before attending the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. He and his wife, Janice Sanford Beck, have 3 children and a grandchild. Sanford is Janice's family name. She and Shawn both use both last names. They now again live in Saskatoon, but spent almost 8 years living off the grid north of North Battleford. Very off the grid. Electricity from a couple of solar panels. Cell phone, but no landline. Solar provided just enough power to barely keep the phones and computer charged, as well as a couple of light bulbs. No running water, no plumbing. Water was hauled from the lake, wood for heating, and the wood stove. Most of the food was grown or raised on the homestead, including wheat for flour, which was all ground and sifted by hand, and oats for breakfast, which were sown, cut, stooked, winnowed, cleaned, and cracked by hand. Janice has published one book of her own, as well as a series she wrote with her father. Their son Christopher has published academic articles in philosophy journals, as well as editing the book Shawn wrote with Darcy Blahout, also from Yorkton originally. Shawn worked in Saskatoon with the Indigenous and LGBTQ communities, but has long also been interested in and drawn to Celtic culture and mythology. He made what he refers to as a pilgrimage to Iona, a small island off the western coast of Scotland that is recognized as the cradle of Christianity in Scotland. In 563 AD, Saint Columba and his followers arrived on Iona's shores en route to spreading the gospel to the people of Scotland and northern England. Shawn immersed himself in the writings of the early Celtic saints from those early centuries. There he discovered what he has come to believe. As he has said, "I'm not making this stuff up out of thin air. There's definitely roots way back in our past." We had a long conversation. I found it challenging, both from the point of view of fully understanding it and relating it to my own values. But I also found it fascinating to discover these new and some very old concepts. I'm not a religious person, having rejected organized religion in my youth because of the rampant hypocrisy that I was confronted with, and because I found it difficult to accept the central tenet of Calvinism, that everything that happens is predestined. It's something the church tried to rationalize many different ways in catechism classes, none of which made sense to me. I had another issue that did not have a satisfactory answer as far as I was and still am concerned. It is the idea that everyone who lived before Christianity was founded, everyone who lived and still lives today not having heard the message of the Christian church, or those who are committed to and content with their own non-Christian religions and live by values that are common to most of us, they are all condemned to eternal fire and brimstone. If any of those thoughts, questions have ever crossed your mind, if you're open to new ideas, which at first glance seem somewhat off the wall, if not totally, stay with us. We started by looking at his transition from being a priest in the Anglican Church to a new ministry in the United Church. What was it about your experience in the Anglican Church that brought you to that change?
First of all, there are lots of good things about my experience in the Anglican Church, and I value much of it, and miss a lot of it now that I'm sort of shifting away from it. Really love the sort of the ritual, the ceremony of Anglicanism. Lots of good things, a sort of sense of a deep, long tradition. But actually, my switch back into the United Church is actually a return home in some ways. I was part of St. Andrew's United in Yorkton. That's where I was baptized as a teenager and confirmed there, and then got much more ecumenical and married an Anglican and became Anglican. That's part of the shift into the Anglican world. But I think what really triggered the shift for me was a lot of struggles that I was having around the Anglican Church's position around sexuality, human sexuality. It's somewhat, I mean, it's changing now, and there have been changes over the past decade, but really some discriminatory practices and beliefs around same-sex couples, around gender expression, around sexual orientation. And so I tried to work within that framework as long as I could to make change. And I'm really glad that there has been some change. But for me, and for sort of the level of commitment I have to equality for all people, it just wasn't quite fitting. And so a return to the United Church is where my path has gone. For the past 4 years, I've been actually working at St. Andrew's College, which is the United Church Seminary in Saskatoon, doing recruitment. So I was the recruitment ambassador for about 4 years. Right now, I am actually moving into a specialized form of ministry, brand new. It's called Green Spirit Chaplaincy. Probably by the time this podcast is on air, it will have been started. It'll be in the new year, 2025. And it is a ministry specifically to people who are practicing or exploring ecological forms of spirituality. And that could be folks who are Christian, that could be folks who are from other religious traditions or no religious traditions, but who just find that their sense of spirituality, meaning, purpose in life is definitely linked with the sense of the earth, the crisis of the earth right now, climate change, ecological strain, and trying to put those things together. So my chaplaincy will be within those communities.
I asked Shawn to explain Christo-pagan, which, as I mentioned earlier, sounds very contradictory. And for those not familiar with the name Turtle Island, which Shawn mentions, it is a traditional name used by a number of indigenous communities for North America, relating to a creation story where turtles are symbolic of life and earth. You have called yourself a Christo-pagan,
Mm-hmm.
which for most people would be two contradictory concepts or terms or beliefs. How do you get to that point? How do you change from being a fairly conventional Anglican priest to someone who now has an interest in a concern about your ancestors who may not have been Christian?
Well, I don't know if I was ever a conventional Anglican priest. My bishops would tell you otherwise. But yeah, I mean, so I think I've always had what I call both the inner Christian and the inner pagan sort of tousling together in many ways. I guess in the past decade or so, they've really come to a truce. So part of that has been exploring the spirituality of my ancestors, both Anglo-Saxon and Celtic, but also recognizing that many of us have ancestors from various parts of the world who weren't Christian and who came from spiritual traditions that were very vital, very important, very life-giving spiritual traditions. I think particularly of Indigenous folks here on Turtle Island, some of whom are deeply Christian, some of whom are deeply traditional, some of whom blend both of those together in different ways. So I've always had a concern is one word, deep interest in free or other than Christian spiritual traditions. But I am also a very convicted Christian myself. So when I call myself a Christo-pagan, sometimes that's just to sort of help people ask the next question, like, what the heck does that mean? But essentially it means if I had to parse that a little bit, I would say I am Christian in my theology. So I believe in the Trinity. I believe in the dual nature of Christ. I believe in salvation through the cosmic Christ. Now, I would probably describe those in bigger terms than most of the tradition would, but it is still firmly rooted within Christian tradition. However, my cosmology, so not my theology is Christian, my cosmology is pagan. So cosmology is about how the world works. Like, what is it about the world that makes it tick? And so a pagan cosmology I identify as magical, enchanted, animistic, alive, where you've got a world that is much different than sort of dead matter. You've got a world that is full of spirits, full of personalities, full of forces that we often are not aware of other than in very subtle ways. And so most pagan or earth-based cosmologies have that sense of enchantment about it. That at times in Christian history, that's been part of Christian cosmology as well, but these days not so much. That's usually what people would identify as more of a pagan or earth-based cosmology. So it's in that sense that I'm Christo theology, pagan cosmology.
The word pagan gets kind of a bad rap.
I know it still does, doesn't it? It's such
the way you describe it, it's earth-based.
Yeah.
The way most people would see it, it's devil-based, right?
Yeah. No, I know. It's people still tell me that, and I'm like, I guess I've just been in it for so long that it's either a neutral or a positive term for me, just because I've got so many pagan friends. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think especially in certain circles, pagan is still a very scary term, and can be used in quite a derogatory way. So I think those are pieces of language that have shifted in some circles, and I have friends who remind me that when I use those terms, I need to remember that they are still scary terms for some people.
You describe yourself now as living a bi-spiritual life.
Hmm.
Your spirituality consists of more than for most people, where it is
Hmm.
strictly Christianity based.
Yeah.
Do people
Um,
understand this? When you talk to them, do you get blank stares?
it depends who I'm talking to, but actually, more and more people are starting to recognize sort of blended spirituality, or what some people call inter or multiple religious belonging. People are starting to recognize this as more and more a part of many people's experience. So Christo-pagan is not the most recognizable of these blends, but anytime you have, for instance, blended families where you've got people of two different religions, and I don't just mean denominations, but full-blown religions, you've got a Buddhist and a Christian, or you've got a Muslim and a Christian, or whatever, those types of spiritualities, especially among the next generation, among the kids, blend in some ways. There's usually some borrowing of both traditions to create something new. And there are just a number of people, whether they're in blended families or not, who were so much exposed to other religions in a way that we weren't maybe several generations ago. But it's very common that your neighbors are Wiccans, or they're Buddhists, or they're Jews, or they're indigenous traditionalists, or whatever. Like, people have so much more exposure. So I think when we see religion in many ways as part of culture, and we live in a multicultural society, of course this blending is going to happen for more and more people. I'm pretty intentional about it myself, because I am a cleric, I am in ministry, so I have to be a bit more, I have to think through these things a bit more carefully, as a representative of a religious tradition. But even among clergy, I know there are many more who are exploring and integrating different facets of other religious traditions.
Exposure to indigenous culture and beliefs, has that added to or been instrumental in your adoption of some of this?
It really has for me. Over the years, well, over the decades now, I've been pretty heavily involved in reconciliation work, especially within the church, dealing with the church's role in residential schools and in colonialization overall. So I've been working hard trying to build relationships of repair and repentance in those from those situations. And so I'm always encountering indigenous folks who are both Christian and sometimes clergy within the church, and also those who wouldn't consider themselves part of the church too. And the spirituality, the spiritual path that I've encountered again and again, whether it's Cree or Métis or Ojibwe, different forms of indigenous spirituality, seem to me to be so deeply rooted in the earth that when Christians don't have that piece of language, when folks can't sort of understand what people are talking about when they talk about the spirits or medicine, and by that I mean spiritual medicine, or the four-legged people, or the stone people, the tree people, the winged people, when Christians can't understand that, they just they miss out on this whole part of the conversation that could be so rich and so helpful in moving reconciliation forward. So a big part of what I do is trying to help create a language within Christianity that can be an honorable dialogue partner with Indigenous people.
You have said that the Christian church needs to do more than strictly just apologize. The church needs to undertake the unprecedented unheard of and almost unimaginable step of apologizing to the gods, the spirits, and the ancestors of the indigenous people.
Yeah.
I would see that as a very difficult thing for the Christian church to accept, because according to them, there is only one God.
Mm-hmm. Let me unpack the whole thing a little bit, and
Okay.
and I'll start particularly just because it's usually the thing that is red flagged the most is the notion of one God and many gods. So when I say gods, spirits, and ancestors, gods in that sense, it's more like supercharged, like big powers, but still created. So when I'm talking about the gods of my ancestors, Anglo-Saxon or Celtic ancestors, I don't mean that these beings are in the same ontological category as the creator of the entire universe. Other people might talk about them as angels, or if you're Tolkien used the word the Ainur or the Valar for describing these types of powers, incredibly powerful beings who guide cultures and guide peoples, and yet they themselves are guided by, as Tolkien says, Iluvatar, the one God, or the creator of all things. So just to unpack that just a tiny bit, but I still think, even if we neutralize a little bit of the red flags around that, the idea of the Christian church apologizing not just to Indigenous people who have been wounded through the residential schools and other forms of colonialism, but to the spirits of the land that are such a big part of Indigenous spirituality, to the ancestors, those who have gone before from the Indigenous people, and of course the recent ancestors of the children who never returned from residential schools, the graves that have been found in the past, even in just the past 5-6 years. Apologizing to them and to the spirits that have guided different Indigenous people. These are the spirits who are called into the sweat lodges, who are called into the medicine wheels, who are called into the longhouses. These are spirits that Christians have either ignored or demonized for a long time, and the church needs to really take into account the damage done to whole cultures when it's demonized their spirits and their spiritualities.
And that happens not only with Indigenous people, it happens with Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people
Exactly.
in other places who have different beliefs than what Christians would have.
Yes, yeah, it happened in India with Hindu folks. It's happened in Southeast Asia with Buddhists. It's just whenever Christianity, colonization, and militarism join hands, bad things happen. Bad things happen, period. And so there's got to be a real repentance and restoration from many, many centuries of that type of nonsense.
You mentioned Tolkien, his involvement in mythology, together with the fact that he's a very devout Christian, Catholic Christian.
Catholic, yeah.
Do people know that? Does Lord of the Rings give it all away?
Tolkien was very careful that when he wrote Lord of the Rings, he did not want it to be explicitly religious. So there are hints when you know what you're looking for, right? The lembas, the bread of the elves, the way bread, that was a Catholic form of talking about the Eucharist. Look at some of the dates as the fellowship travels through Middle Earth, and you'll see dates that are not just about the journey they're taking. There are dates that are liturgical dates. So December 25th, or there's a date in March that is Lady Day. Like these are liturgical dates. So he sort of disguises it. But when you start to read his letters, he is very open about how the whole what's called the Tolkien legendarium, Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, all of the other writings are really his own sort of deep explorations of faith through the medium of fantasy. Now, his of course, his good friend C.S. Lewis, I think people recognize Lewis much more as very much an open Christian. I mean, his stuff was very explicitly Christian. Although I do encounter some people still these days who read his stuff and don't realize that he's exuding Christianity. So between those two, and there are a few others in their circle too, that they're able to reach into theological depths in a way that honors the mythic imagination of humanity, I think, which is really important.
Has your family been part of your journey from where you started out to where you are now? You said your wife was raised Anglican.
Yeah. Family's always been supportive, both my parents and my wife. Janice still remains Anglican. She's at the cathedral in Saskatoon. We've always been an ecumenical family, so it's always been more about primary faith commitments, and the denominational stuff comes second. She's very much an ecological person herself. Big gardener and a weaver, and lots of stuff with herbs and all types of things. Her theology is very similar to mine. She uses somewhat different language around it, but certainly we've shared this spiritual adventure together. Yes. And my kids, they're at different places as one's children often end up, and they're taking their own spiritual adventures. Of the three, one is very involved with church. One considers themselves agnostic, and the other considers themselves atheist. I just honor that because people have very different spiritual journeys. I call it spiritual, whether they do or not, journeys of meaning, journeys of purpose. As a universalist, so someone who believes that all shall be saved and all shall be well, I don't get too freaked out by anybody who says, well, I'm going to be pagan, or I'm going to be atheist, or I'm going to be a fundamentalist. Actually, if they say I'm going to be a fundamentalist, that's when I get worried.
New to me is Green Spirit chaplaincy, established in the United Church and forming the work in which Shawn is now involved.
I think there is an unfulfilled need. I've been noticing that for years. There are many people within the church that as soon as their faith journey leads them too far in the way of spiritual exploration of other traditions, earthen traditions, and commitment to the earth, they end up feeling like they need to leave the church. Either the church that they're in just can't handle those types of questions and gets all nervous and sort of gives them the boot, or they're not finding what they need within their church tradition. Over the past decade, or even more, since I wrote the book Christian Animism, I immediately started getting phone calls, emails from around the world, really, mainly Turtle Island and Europe, but some much further afield, of people saying, this is what my heart says. I didn't know there was a word for it. And I don't have any friends here. I don't have any church people here who can help me understand it. So I've been in these conversations for a long time. There are starting to be more groups that are taking seriously the mix of ecology and spirituality. So there's things like the Forest Church movement in the UK and Wild Church in North America. We've now got a Christian Animism network. It crosses the Atlantic, and we've been meeting together regularly online for a number of years. So there are more and more people, I think, who are interested in this, but who haven't really found a place to have the conversation. I still get emails, probably several a month, where people say, I just found what you're doing, and that's really what I want to explore. I put up the new Facebook page for Green Spirit Chaplaincy. Put it up within 5 hours, literally 100 people signed up for it online. Now that, Facebook and social media, that doesn't necessarily mean like you've got 100 people, showing up for a church service. It's a different type of thing.
You might have 50 and 50 trolls, right?
Yeah, exactly. Who knows? But it does say to me that there is a strong interest, and there's need out there. There's hunger out there for forms of community that honor people's Christian faith and honor the fact that they're also looking beyond that too, and that maybe that's actually part of the work of the Spirit in their lives.
This is centered in Saskatoon at the present time. Are you the only or the first at this point?
This is the first chaplaincy of its kind within the United Church. Yeah, it's the first sort of formal one. There are other ones that are a bit more localized, like I say, the Forest Church movement and Wild Church movement. But in terms of a chaplaincy that is in a place but really extends online far beyond a place, this is the first one of its kind. Yeah.
What do you say to people, as I'm sure you will or have heard? This is all kind of new age gobbledygook. This is just jargon. This is in part because people don't understand, or because the words relate to things that they've always been told is not good.
Yeah. For folks who care enough to engage me with that contradiction, I just like to get into the conversation. So often it's about exploring what those words mean for people. And so sometimes when we talk and we open it up a little bit further, all of a sudden the folks who are very sort of opposed to this they start scratching their heads and go, oh, well, I hadn't really thought of it like that. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. There are always going to be people for whom this is just gobbledygook, and it's kooky and it's new age and all of that stuff. My experience, though, is those have not been the people who have reached out to me. The people who reach out to me are the ones who are already intuiting that this is an important path for them. I'm a systematics theologian, so when people sort of accuse me of being loosey-goosey in my thinking, I'm like, okay, well, first of all, let's see where your theology is at to see if you can handle this conversation to begin with. And then let's get into it, because all of it for me is very, as a systematics theologian, all of this is very well thought out. Most people, that's not their concern. So they're more interested in the spirituality of it than the theology of it. But I do both.
I mentioned a common concern of many, Christian and non-Christian alike, about the influence of some branches of Christianity on shaping and reshaping government policy, which is very evident in the United States with the change in leadership there.
I try not to obsess over what's going on south of the border. It's hard not to, though. And certainly it's not just south of the border. There are phenomena in Canada that are going in the same direction. For me, I see this as, I just named that unholy trinity: Christianity, colonization, and militarism. This is sort of what I hope is actually the last harsh gasps of that particular beast over the years. But I think sometimes when a system knows it's coming to the end, that's when it fights the hardest. And I think that's what we're seeing these days.
The future of the church as an institution. Do you have thoughts on that? Because it seems to me that especially the mainstream, the traditional churches, are losing members at an ever increasing rate.
Do I have thoughts about the church? I have a few thoughts about the church, and I'll only speak for mainline denominations in a North American context, because the context in Asia, in Africa, different parts of the world, very different, right? So I can't speak to those contexts. Those are very, very different historical, political, social situations. Here in North America and in Canada, the mainline Protestant denominations they're in the process of shutting one church after another. Do I think that's going to stop? I don't think that's going to stop. Am I worried about that as an institution? Not particularly, because I see this sort of like an alchemical process. In alchemy, your first phase is always dissolution. It's things dissolve, and then there's a phase of like recombination, and then there's a third phase of rebirth. We are well into the dissolution. I have no fear that the Spirit of God is going to be doing something to recombine the elements, and there will be some form of resurrection. It's not going to look like what it has for the centuries of Christendom, though. I think it'll look a lot smaller. I think it'll look like a lot less building focused. I think it'll look like people gathering in coffee shops and in groves of the forest where 2 or 3 are gathered. And I think it'll be focused on service, on love, on finding meaning together, not on doctrine, not on hierarchy, not on power and control and fear. I think it's going to look very different.
Watch for and listen to another podcast in the next month. Visit yorktonstories.ca to hear this and all previous podcasts. And there you can also sign up to our email list so we can let you know when a new episode is available. You can support us with a donation if you wish to help defer the cost of the technology that makes these podcasts possible. Thanks again to Harvest Meats and Grain Millers for their support, and thank you for listening. Your comments and suggestions are always welcome. Get in touch through our website or by emailing Dick, D-I-C-K, at yorktonstories.ca. And join us again for more Yorkton Stories.